This episode of Presumption of Guilt, we are looking at Blaise's trial, the state versus Kirsten Lobato, and everything that led up to it. Before I get into the trial, I want to introduce you to Michelle Revelle. Michelle became a sort of mother figure for Blaise alongside Blaise's stepmom, Becky. Michelle also became an advocate for Blaise. Here's Michelle talking about how her and Blaise met.
She was introduced to me by my son, who met her up in Panaca when he was four-wheeling with some friends, and came home and told me, "Mom, I just met the girl I want to marry." Then she got arrested, and he's talking to me about this. And he's telling me, she just got arrested and this and that. And he's going on and he's talking to her folks and they're talking back and forth. And I'm thinking, oh my God, my son is like, just met the girl he wants to marry and she's getting arrested for murder. But he kept saying, but Mom, she didn't do it. But Mom, she didn't do it. I know she didn't do it. Mom, she didn't do it. And I'm like, how do you know she didn't do it? Well, she told me she didn't do it. Well, you don't know her that well either.
But Michelle not only followed Blaise's case, but attended every hearing, court date, and began telling people about the case, which she called an injustice. 3 days after Blaise is arrested on July 23, 2001, police go back to Diane Parker at her apartment, which she shares with her boyfriend, Stephen King. Duran Bailey's body was found about 100 yards from where Diane Parker lived. Diane Parker, you may remember, is the woman who accused Duran Bailey of raping her less than a week before he turned up dead. On this day, when speaking with police, Diane tells officers, quote, "Oh, I forgot to tell you, last time you were here, I had bloody clothes." The detectives say, "From your attack?" And she says yes, and then they move on. Police were previously at her apartment the morning after Duran Bailey was found dead. So the morning after the murder, she had bloody clothes in her apartment. Few things I want to point out here. When Diane Parker went to police about her rape, which happened on July 1st, she gave a lot of details, graphic details, and never once did she mention any blood. Not from when he put a knife to her neck, and not when describing being sodomized by him. Is it possible the clothes were from her attack? Of course. But the fact she didn't mention this the morning after the murder is interesting. Police did not collect those clothes or even look at them. During the same time, Blaise's car, which was impounded to search for evidence, was also released back to her father after crime scene techs find no evidence in Blaise's car of Duran Bailey and no evidence of Blaise being at the crime scene. Prior to trial, Blaise is held at the Clark County Detention Center in Las Vegas, charged with first-degree murder with a deadly weapon and necrophilia, which is the sexual penetration of a dead human body. That necrophilia charge stems from the medical examiner's finding that Duran Bailey's rectum was cut or stabbed after he was already dead. The death penalty remains on the table, some pretty intense charges. Michelle Revelle remembers her son was outraged about Blaise's arrest and said he knew for sure she was in Panaca at the time Duran Bailey was murdered.
The more he talked to her and kept telling me things that were happening, and I kept saying, this can't be right. There's something wrong here. There's something not right. This doesn't even add up. This doesn't even make sense. And I'd start asking her questions. Well, what about this? Or what about that? Or did somebody try this? And most of the time it was stuff she didn't know. I just couldn't stand the thought that something this wrong was going on under my nose, and I didn't do something about it. I couldn't not speak up. You know, that whole adage about, if you remain silent. And I couldn't live with myself if I just walked away.
Blaise's public defender is Phil Cohn. Phil says prior to that preliminary hearing, the prosecutor on the case was Eric Jorgensen, and Eric Jorgensen brought him a deal for Blaise right before trial began.
I had a one-day offer from Jorgensen to, look, this case is being taken away from me on Monday, but if you can get her to plead between now and then, I'll go to 3 to 10. I'll drop it down to 3 years. I can tell you that she and I went out to lunch the day after Jorgensen, offered it to me, and I banged on her very, very hard. Look, I know you didn't do this, but you're talking about a 3 to 10. You've already done a certain amount. I can't remember what she had done in custody at that point. You got to do this. And she said no.
Despite Blaise looking at a minimum of 40 years if convicted and having to register as a sex offender because of that necrophilia charge, Phil Cohn says Blaise was adamant about not pleading to a crime she says she didn't commit. If Blaise took the deal, she would have served about 3 years in prison. The deal was for 4 years, but she had already served some time. And just think about this. 3 years for an insanely brutal murder which involved torture. To me, that says the prosecution wasn't sure they'd win the case. Shortly after the deal was made, Eric Jorgensen was no longer the prosecutor.
Well, he got his taken off.
Why?
I have no idea. Eric was a really reasonable guy, and that's the problem with the DA's office, is that they're there to do justice, but you have ambitious people. He was a very honorable prosecutor, and he made a fair offer.
It was around this time, either in court or at one of her prelim trials, Blaise saw a photo of Duran Bailey, the man she thought attacked her, and was very confused. I told Phil Cohn about this.
Well, Blaise told me that when she was in court, a picture of Duran Bailey was put up, and she told me that she said to herself, like, who the fuck is that?
She might have said it to me.
The case was now going to be prosecuted by William Kephart and Sandra DiGiacomo, 2 prosecutors with big ambitions. And on May 8, 2002, the state versus Kirsten Lobato begins. The judge is District Court Judge Valerie Vega. The state believes Blaise left from Panaca sometime in the late evening of July 7th and drove 2.5 hours to Vegas to buy meth from Duran Bailey. The state says Blaise and Duran Bailey were going to exchange sex for drugs when something happened. Maybe Duran didn't have the drugs, or maybe he hurt Blaise. And that's when Blaise pulled out her knife and stabbed him.
I cut his penis. I remember that. I think I was trying to cut it off, but I don't know if I actually did.
Here is attorney Stephen Jackson to explain the basis of the state's case.
She went to Duran Bailey in order to purchase drugs from him, and that deal went south and she killed him, which happens. The problem with that is there's no evidence that Duran Bailey was a drug dealer. Duran Bailey is homeless. I don't know many homeless drug dealers.
Prior to the start of trial, a preliminary hearing was held. Multiple people testified, including Detective Thowson. He is asked by Blaise's public defender Phil Cohn why there isn't a police report yet, to which Thowson says there's just so many murders, they're behind. So they were able to arrest Blaise without finishing the police report. Phil Cohn says he spoke with the medical examiner, Dr. Larry Sims, to narrow down a time of death.
Because I talked to him a week before. He said something at the preliminary hearing when we were asking about how would you tell time of death. He said about testing the eyes. And so I asked him the week before, did you do it? He says, no. I said, so is there any change? No. It's still 10 to 12 hours. And then he comes in and says 10 to 18 hours, which puts it at nighttime the day before. We can't account for her because she's in bed in a different room. And that's when the theory changes.
During the preliminary hearing, Dr. Sims testified that he did not have a specific time of death, but he believed it was around 12 hours before the body was found, so no earlier than 10:36 a.m. on July 8th. And Blaise had an alibi for that time. Even the prosecution conceded that Blaise was seen in Panaca the morning of July 8th around 10 a.m. If that was the case, it wasn't possible for Blaise to commit the murder. Remember, it takes 2.5 hours to get from Vegas to Panaca. Beyond time of death, Dr. Sims also talked about some of Duran Bailey's injuries during that preliminary hearing. Dr. Sims testified the stab wound in the rectum area of Duran Bailey, the stab wound which allowed Blaise to be charged with sexual penetration of a dead body, happened before Duran Bailey died. Now, reading from the court transcripts, here's Phil Cohn. Phil, it's clear to you every one of the stab wounds was post-mortem, is that right? Dr. Sims, not every one of the stab wounds, for instance, in the rectum area was ante-mortem. Several were ante-mortem. Hans Schur is a journalist who works on wrongful convictions and followed Blaise's case.
Sims testified specifically in the preliminary hearing that Bailey's rectum wound was ante-mortem, but Blaise had been charged with inflicting a wound on a dead body, on Duran Bailey's rectum, when he was dead. Well, Sims testified at the preliminary hearing that he was alive when that wound. That's something else that Sims changed his testimony. He said, oh no, the rectum wound was post-mortem. Somebody somehow was conveyed to him that he needed to have an attitude adjustment about that wound.
I asked Dr. Sims about this, and he said the stenographer heard rectum when he really said scrotum. Dr. Sims also went on to say the rectum was cut post-mortem because there was no hemorrhaging. But that's not what he testified to at the preliminary hearing. Now, reading again from the court transcripts, this is Dr. Sims. Quote, "The slash wound itself was a fairly deep wound that occurred just by taking a knife and kind of spreading the buttocks and slashing across. It was as deep as a normal adult could have done. To give you an idea of the depth, there was hemorrhaging associated with it." Now, let's fast forward to the trial. Dr. Sims opens up his timeline for when Duran Bailey could be killed and moves the time of death to as early as 4 a.m. on July 8th. This adjustment was crucial to the prosecution's case and was one of the only small windows of time Blaise wasn't seen.
My name is Larry Sims. Well, I've done about 10,000 autopsies, and I've testified well over 500 times, and primarily in state court and then a minority in federal court.
Dr. Larry Sims has an extensive background as a doctor and medical examiner and did the autopsy for Duran Bailey.
I've been actively practicing since 79, basically, so that'll be 40 some odd years.
I reached out to Dr. Larry Sims in hopes of him clarifying the potential time of death for Duran Bailey. It's been more than 20 years since he first testified about this case, so I asked him what he initially remembered. To my surprise, almost immediately, Dr. Sims had this to say.
There's a lot of technical things that I remember about it. I said in all my testimonies that a female didn't do this. This is not how females do this. This is the work of a male, and there's a sexual aspect to it, whether it was a homosexual issue or whether it was payback issue or something. I guess the phrase extreme hostility. You only see those, as a forensic pathologist, every so often. This is not the kind of homicide I won't be involved with, which means that it was a man. That's what I'm trying to communicate.
A coroner investigator who worked with Dr. Sims declared Duran Bailey deceased at 3:50 a.m. July 9th. Dr. Sims did his autopsy of Duran Bailey at noon the same day. Based on that time of death at 3:50 a.m., Dr. Sims believed Duran Bailey was killed 12 to 18 hours prior to that, based on rigor mortis.
How long does it take for a body to get into full rigor mortis?
It's going to be anywhere from 12 to 18 hours as an average, so between 10 a.m. and 4 p.m.
Despite saying rigor mortis sets in between 12 to 18 hours, at trial, Dr. Sims expanded that time of death by 6 hours, testifying Duran Bailey could be killed as early as 4:36 a.m. Here again is journalist Hans Schur.
I found a paper I'd made of how his testimony changed between the preliminary hearing and then the first trial, and where he widened the window to fit the prosecution's, to fit Blaise's alibi witnesses. He had to open the possible window of time of death in order for the prosecution to legitimately argue that he died in the early morning hours. I don't know how it was conveyed to him, but somehow it was conveyed to him that they needed him to adjust his testimony.
That extension of time allowed the possibility of Blaise leaving Panaca and driving the 2.5 hours to Las Vegas and time to kill Duran Bailey and drive back to Panaca, all to be seen by about 10 a.m. the following morning. Despite dozens of people placing Blaise in Panaca on July 7th and 8th, overnight, only her immediate family could place her. Her defense argues it's because she was sleeping. The prosecution says that's when she killed Duran Bailey. If you talk to any of Blaise's supporters, they believe Dr. Sims changed his theory to fit the prosecution's timeline. And that's something Dr. Sims said he would never do. Dr. Sims told me as a medical examiner, they base time of death in part on rigor mortis. He told me every body he examines is different and says rigor mortis isn't foolproof. Dr. Sims says that's what allowed for the fluctuation in time of death. Dr. Sims is saying there was a high likelihood it could be 12 to 18 hours and a small likelihood it could be up to 24 hours or that 4 a.m. time of death.
Rigor mortis is highly unpredictable. I'm not saying that you can't use it, but what we're talking about is the weight of a conclusion as to rigor mortis.
So rigor mortis should be a building block to the case.
And that'd be a good way to put it, or you need corroborative evidence with it.
During the trial, Dr. Sims testified there was a 95% chance Duran Bailey died between 9:50 a.m. and 3:50 p.m. on July 8th, the day he was found, when it's undisputed that Blaise was at her parents' house. But Dr. Sims allowed for that 5% chance that Duran Bailey could have been murdered between 3:50 a.m. and 9:50 a.m., and that's what the prosecution based their case upon, a 5% chance of overnight time. In that window of time, prosecutors say Blaise met up with Duran Bailey and stabbed him and then hit him with a baseball bat. So how did a baseball bat even come into the conversation? When Detective Thowson and Detective James LaRochelle initially spoke to Blaise the day she was arrested, they asked her if she had any weapons in her car. Blaise paused for a moment before saying, quote, "A bat."